I guess the first kind of question I want to throw at Ron is, I first became aware of his work in 1997. He was showing at the Ore Gallery on the Lower East Side, on the east side of Vancouver. Yeah. And, you were making, I think at that point, sort of gray square paintings with text derived from yearbooks. And I quite fell in love with that work. And I'm just sort of thinking a little bit about you, 1997, that's 25 years ago. I want to go back in time a little further, and I want to ask you how you became interested in art. Like, what were you doing as a kid, or where did you find art in your world?
When I was much younger, I had no real ambitions to be an artist. I think maybe the closest thing was maybe potentially a cartoonist, maybe, but beyond, like, nothing more than that. So
were you doing drawings as a kid, or?
Yeah, most kids make doodles,
Yeah.
So,
what were you drawing?
Well, I was a nerd, so it was like, superhero kind of stuff. So it was like pretty, basic, I would say, But that was the extent of my even art awareness, was comic books, essentially. So
how did that sort of move from that kind of activity, that kind of interest, into art school? How did you end up in art school?
My ambitions, like post high school, was just to go to like a community college and maybe pursue graphic design. But then, because I was still kind of doodling, like someone said, like, well, why don't you also apply for art school? Like, what could it hurt? Like, set your bar a little higher than the community college kind of thing. So I applied and I got accepted, so I just chose the art school over the technical college. So
what art school did you go to?
I went to Emily Carr. So.
And what was that like? What was the environment like when you were in there? So what years were you in art school?
I went straight out of high school into art school, so that's like the period of like 1987 to 91. So really going back, right?
And what was happening in the school at the time?
Like, I grew up in a suburb of Vancouver, so it was like taking the bus in like for an hour and a bit every morning, right? So for me, like, I never felt that close to the art school, at least not for the first like 2.5 years. And in fact, I was thinking of dropping out of art school because when I took a graphic design class, I wasn't that keen on it, which again is odd because there's a lot of typography in my work now, so in a roundabout way, I've become a graphic designer, but that was never my intent. I thought, like, well, like being an artist just didn't seem like a possibility.
Right. So there's this kind of low point. You're going to leave. Why do you hold on? Why do you stay? And what keeps you there?
Just before, like, thinking of dropping out of art school, I thought, like, the printmaking department offered a field trip to go to New York. So I made that trip, and that was basically the start of where it just kind of opened up for me.
So what happened in New York?
Well, it's silly. Like, I saw like Jasper John's Three Flags, and I just thought, like, God, this is like really simple. Like, not simple, like, but I was also seduced by how simple the painting is. And then, it also instilled in me, like, oh, I think I can do this. Because it had a graphic sensibility, and at this point in art school, I wasn't that proficient. Yeah. So this was just this kind of window of like, oh, maybe there is this capacity or this room to do something else, akin to like Jasper John's.
Yeah, I'm also thinking a little bit about your history with painting as well. So there's a period where Ron is making paintings. I think you make 2 or 3 series. I think the last one would have been the Jeopardy series. So he was painting the answers that you hear on Jeopardy, which are always questions. There's a great set of paintings like that, and you then kind of stop painting and start making signs. Probably posters, probably lots of other things. I'm just kind of curious why that moment happened in time, what was going on with you, and what you were doing in that period.
By the time I got to my last body of paintings, which back in '99, I decided to stop, right? So, and it was weird because at the same time, it coincided with my working with a gallery. And I just felt like when I did that, my first commercial gallery show, I thought like, well, I could just keep making paintings in whatever color, and like it was like a fashion statement. Like every season, what's the fashionable color? And that thought horrified me. So, you know, like what any good artist would do, they'd shoot themselves in the foot and do something completely different, which is what I did for 10 years.
So what were you doing?
It just led me down to becoming a pseudo-graphic designer in some ways. The thing that I rejected very early on as a young student, I ended up sort of working with graphic designers and then sort of infiltrating these places where exhibitions are announced, this kind of thing, as the work. Instead of replicating something as a painting, why don't you just occupy the means of dissemination?
Can you tell us a little bit about the sign you made in Windsor and what happened there?
When I was invited to make a site visit to the Art Gallery Windsor, I mean, you're driving in and you see this cityscape, but then you realize it's not Windsor. You're actually looking at Detroit. So it was like one of these awakens. It's like, I'm going to make art about that, basically. So I had the city of Windsor erect a sign that basically says, you have left the American sector in English and French. But little did I know it would, be a bit of a shit show after that.
So what happened? What happened?
Well, it was removed in 3 days.
Why was that?
I think the economy in Windsor were kind of threatened by losing Americans coming over. I don't know why, but this is what I was told, that they thought it would affect their economy.
I want to shift a little bit. I wanted to give you a sense of where Ron is coming from, and just shift a little bit now into this body of work here. I want to talk about TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, acronym TLDR. That's the name of this work and the series. And just want to ask you, how did you end up making this work? Like, what started all of this? Where does it come from?
The way I typically work is like I just get tired of the previous work that I was working on, and it just leads me somewhere else. So in this case, I was working on this body of work called Jack, and it's basically a word-for-word sort of transcription or retranscription of Jack Goldstein's biography on canvas. So that particular body of work was so much about a particular moment in time in a very small world.
A person.
Yeah.
A cipher for you.
Yeah, that I felt like after the conclusion of that work, I wanted to do something completely opposite. I mean, text just seemed like a much greater world. It was more inclusive, like everyone had access to it because everyone is constantly on their devices. So I thought this was an interesting way to talk about something greater than the art world, which I've been kind of obsessed with for the last 10 years at that time. So,
like you started collecting these headlines from The Verge, right?
Yeah.
And what was it about the headlines?
Well, when I was first directed towards the website, The Verge, I mean, when I started reading the headlines, they didn't really seem like proper news. They didn't read like proper news. Like some of it weren't even weren't even worthy of being news. Like some of it was very kind of flippant or trivial or banal. But then at the same time, you would see these other headlines that were dissecting Facebook or Twitter or what have you. And I thought, oh, maybe there's something going on this website. But again, I followed it for about a year, not thinking that it was like material for work. It just sort of naturally evolved to that.
I want to talk a little bit about the title of the work. We have the title for this show, which is We Did This to Ourselves, which is a sign work. So while we were working on this, this particular body of work is called TLDR. I didn't think it was a great title for a show, and I wanted to think with Ron a little bit about that. And so, do you want to talk about how that unfolded?
Yeah, you just didn't like TLDR, so you put me on the spot, and I had to do something. I mean, it was quite straightforward. So, but with the Verge website, it has these sort of daily headers that would try to summarize today's events of the news, and then one would just happen to say, we did this to ourselves. So, being the text-based guy that I am, I just clipped it, put it in my pocket, and thought I'd save it for another day. So when you said you didn't like the name of the show, TLDR, then I said, well, okay, I just pulled this out because I thought it still spoke to this work in a very interesting way.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you make them, the actual method of making these works, and what that looks like?
It's funny because like the work is about technology, but I'm using like a really old form of technology, which is just, it's like a vinyl cutter, right? So, which is what I use to create stencils. So they're basically stencils. So the only labor I would say is in kerning the text, if you know what that means, by getting the spacing in the letters and the words right, and then just like hitting cut, taking that stencil, peeling out the negative, putting the letters on the canvas, painting over it, and then carefully removing the letters.
So laying down black and then building up white.
There's some like labor involved in it, but I mean, it's pretty banal labor.
I watched you do it. I watched him
You
do
have?
it. Yeah, I was in your studio. I asked you to show me because it's very meticulous work. It is very, like, you have to be very focused and careful when you're doing that. It's pretty meticulous.
No, I mean, because you have to take a knife to it to lift it through these layers of paint. But I mean, again, it's not that like mysterious. It's just straightforward, which is what I like.
I think it's nice for people to hear how you place them, what's going on with the placement. It's all very specific, right?
It is and it isn't. I mean, I wouldn't read so much into it other than I basically wanted to create a pattern or a running frieze. And it didn't matter so much what size text was on what size canvas. I mean, obviously, like, the more stupid the headlines, sometimes I want to make those ones bigger, but beyond that, there wasn't too much involved in it. I mean, I just started from January and I just started basically tiling out these headlines and coming up with a grid pattern.
And they're chronological.
Yeah, I mean, like, I would make them in, like, months, basically.
If you were to take down one of the paintings off the wall and have a look at the back of it, it would have a date on it, and it would have a stamp with Ron's name and Ron's signature. I think those are all the things.
The stamp is because I don't like my handwriting.
Yeah, and what's nice about the date, though, is you can link it to, if you actually put one of these headlines into your phone, connected to The Verge, you will learn what date this headline appeared, and you can then search sort of the New York Times or the Globe and Mail and see how they're reporting news. And I think tech has a very kind of slightly, it's a kind of very corporate way of looking at the world. So you're looking through a certain kind of lens and looking glass. I think it's really important to remember that. But you think about the date and the title, you think about Ron's work, you think about text, and you can't help but think about somebody like Onkwara, who...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so where does all that fit in? Like, he's a hero of yours, I think.
Well, I mean, he's certainly like a hero of mine, right? And like, he was obsessed with time, right? He made date paintings, and if he didn't finish the painting of that date, he would destroy it. Like, he was a bit of a nut bar, so that way. But what I also liked about his work was that he would actually clip the newspaper clipping of that day's news and stick it in a little box that would house his small date paintings. So, I mean, I don't know if I was overtly thinking that when I was like marking the time on the back of the canvases, but I mean, it's certainly there because, I mean, his work has been very influential for me, so.
How do you think about this kind of history painting? It's being a moment in time for us to think about moral and ethical considerations of moments in time. A work like this, what do you think it does? Like, what does it activate?
Well, I think when you scan this work, I think it tells you something about our reliance on tech more and more, and how a lot of how we experience or view the world is through a screen, right? Mm-hmm. And then what I also like about painting is it contradicts that, right? In some ways, it's like the oldest medium for communication. It brings back a kind of contemplative moment to something that is constantly fleeting from us. Mm-hmm. So it's trying to straddle both these things. In some ways, it's trying to like physically show you like how much information that we're bombarded by constantly, but it's also a way of distilling it and suspending it for a moment. But at the same time, I think tech is also perhaps ruining how we experience paintings or encounter older forms of art, because we don't do that anymore. We just Google something if we don't understand it, right? Or you take a selfie in front of the artwork and then you look at the art later, kind of thing. It's really bizarre. So I kind of want the work to straddle both those spheres, like something that's like gone from traditional painting, but also bring it back to traditional painting.
And so where are you now? What are you thinking about? What are you looking at?
Well, it's just like anything. When you're focused on something like this for so long, then your mind wanders and you think of what I can do next. And out of this work, I've been thinking about, well, what are the ramifications or consequences of all this information, and certainly this year that we lived through, right? I mean, as you go along and look at this work, there's also like a political dimension, certainly as it happened in the States. So I've been thinking about how the proliferation of information can kind of also lead to misinformation or distrust of media and whatnot. So now I've kind of been thinking about this kind of more radicalization or extremism. So I've been taking these texts of like people that just don't believe in anything anymore. Or, no, that's not true. They believe in something, but they just don't align with your view, for example. So I'm kind of interested in that.
So what sorts of things do you want to go into a little bit more depth?
Like what were these texts?
Yeah.
Well, like one would be like, there was this governor in Georgia, I forget her name, Caitlin something. She had on her bus in Georgia, because she was running for governor, it just said, "Jesus, guns, babies." So I've been kind of interested in this kind of out there stuff, like guns save lives, build the wall tall, what else is there? It's okay to be white, like stuff like that. So that's where my work is right now. Yeah.
I think maybe on that note, we'll sort of...
Sorry about that. Yeah.